the first of our Conan Fitness Platinum webinars. Tonight's topic is about just the basic guidelines of nutrition, the purpose of which is to, when we do future webinars, our idea is to go a little bit more into detail on certain aspects or certain topics. And for those people who are a little bit new to it, at least they can refer to this to get, as we call it, just the guidelines, just the facts about, general macronutrients, a little bit about micronutrients, and a little bit about caloric intakes and expenditures, just so that they've got the basis, so that when we're going into a little bit more detail in the future, at least they've got an idea and it doesn't go straight over their head. They can simply refer to this. Another part of tonight is just to give you an idea of how these work or what they're designed for. A large part of it is meant to be interactive, in that generally we would suggest a topic, i.e. basic nutrition guidelines, but out of it we expect that there'll be a lot of questions. And that interaction is fantastic because we can use those questions to either answer them on the spot in the given webinar, or to put those questions together, collate them, and use that as the topic for a future webinar. So we very much welcome your questions. Obviously, you won't have voice during the webinar, but what you can do is just type a question in the chat box, and if you've got a microphone, we can give you voice, and you can ask the question. Everyone can hear it, and hopefully everyone else can benefit from the answer. So tonight we're going to go into a little bit of the basics of nutrition. That doesn't just mean macronutrients and micronutrients, but a little bit about, if you've got a pen and a calculator with you, if you haven't, grab one, because you'll actually get an idea tonight of roughly what you can expect to see from a caloric intake perspective of your daily needs. And we'll actually go into that tonight. So as far as our topics, if you have a look at this, we'll go into the principles of nutrition. Again, just the basic nutrition guidelines. You'll be able to determine each of your individual caloric needs. Now that is very much person to person and based on lifestyles, so activity levels, your exercise habits, etc. But we'll go into that in a bit more detail. We'll understand optimal macronutrient ratios and how to apply it to your varying lifestyles. So if you look at this, I like to refer to this diagram of just a skeleton, because this stems from the questions that always comes up when people say, oh, can I reach this kind of figure, or can I reach this kind of, they show us a picture of someone they want to look like, and they'll say, I can never look like that person because I'm big boned, or, I've just got this kind of shaped hips. But when we look at the skeleton, other than height, you notice that the dimensions don't vary a huge amount. Like, you do get large variances in height, but you don't in say shoulder width or pelvic girdle width. And the whole point of that is to say that the general structure or shape of a human is actually pretty standard, pretty typical. And if you then slap on the next layer, which is muscles, when you think of the shape of a human, or the ideal shape of a human, that doesn't come just from the skeleton, because that looks a little bit anorexic, but the muscles are what give us shape. Now, anytime we talk about someone that's out of shape, or, I've got this out of proportion to that, I don't like my legs or my thighs or my belly or whatever it is, generally that's not coming from the skeleton and it's not coming from muscles. So what then is it possibly coming from? And the only real option is fat. So when we talk about nutrition or changing someone's physique, really the two biggest constituents of change is muscle and fat. You don't change bones. And we don't change muscle a huge amount, so really we're just talking about fat. If you look at these three, they're just obviously fictional pictures, but it shows the representation of the exact same skeleton in three different scenarios, the only difference there being muscle and fat, the main difference being fat, whereas someone might say the person on the left is, bigger boned or just heavier set. You hear lots of things, but really when you knuckle down to it, the skeletal system, the muscular system, isn't that different. So really we're talking about that. So the idea of our nutrition plans and our exercise plans will come down to how do we optimize maintaining muscle, and if not improving it, but ideally decreasing fat, because that's when we'll get the shape that everyone kind of talks about. So tonight is just about the nutrition side of it, not so much about training. We can go into that next time, but in the guidelines of nutrition, this is what we're going to cover tonight. When we talk about calories or caloric intake, the main basis for weight control, as most people have heard, is the whole calories in and calories out. And we'll be speaking about that tonight only from a general perspective. For those that know a bit of our work, they know that we use this as a guide, and for the people that are in the industry, we know it's actually not as simple as that sounds. There's actually a lot more to it than that. But from a general perspective, it is fairly close and fairly easy just to generalize and say calories in versus calories out, and we'll go into the factors that affect both of them. But if you look at especially one of the articles we've sent most recently, the one called "This Nutrient Supply Timing is Everything," it's on our website, so you can just go to our website under the articles, under the blog section, and download it. But that tells you that a calorie actually isn't just a calorie. There's a lot more to it. But for general purposes and for at least a guideline, we're going to stick with this. So of all the foods that we eat, generally they all come down to our three main macronutrients, which is carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And we call them the macronutrients because they've got the caloric content in them. When we talk about the other types of nutrients like vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, water, those things we certainly need, but they don't actually carry any calories. So from a macronutrient perspective, it's just those three, and with the lovely addition of alcohol, unfortunately, that's second only to fat in the caloric content. But it's part of our social life, so we need to recognize that. And so working with that, we've actually got 4 nutrients that do supply calories. So when we talk about calories in, they're the 4 things we're talking about. When we talk about calories out, so to balance that whole equation, the calories in, calories out equation, there's 3 main components of it. If you see on the bottom of that PowerPoint, that page there, it says TDEE, and that stands for total daily energy expenditure. So the total amount of energy you expend over the day is actually, it's fairly hard to measure, but really the best way to measure it is by breaking it down to its 3 main components. The first and foremost there is the basal metabolism, or basal metabolic rate. Obviously exercise, so we know that when we go and train and exercise, we burn more calories, so that increases our total daily energy expenditure. And daily activities, this is a funny one. It's kind of something between basal metabolism, which is the amount of calories that you burn just at rest. So if you were to think of someone not even just sitting down, we're talking about lying down, and has been laying down for at least 5-10 minutes, so everything's kind of calmed down, like when you first wake up in the morning and breathing's low, heart rate's low, and everything's just at its base levels. There's still a lot of calorie needs as far as your brain's still got to tick, heart's still got to beat. Every cell in your body still needs to respire and still needs energy to do that. So that's the major component of TDEE. Exercise is obviously right up the other end, where the caloric needs per minute is very high. But what about everything in between? So if you were to just walk to the fridge, if you're brushing your teeth, if you're just doing the ironing or working at a desk, you're certainly not exercising, but you're also certainly not at rest. So we're going to try and we're going to put a strategy together as far as how we try and categorize that, so that you can actually measure it. So let's move on. Remember that if you've got a piece of paper, you can scribble this down, that if you look per gram at our 4 macronutrients, carbs, protein, fat, and alcohol, per gram, you can see the breakup of calories. And remember, when I say calorie isn't just a calorie, because we'll go into another factor that you need to consider, that where it says carbs and protein, they are pretty similar as far as it looks exactly similar. They're not exact, but they're rounded to 4 calories per gram. So each gram of carbs has got about 4 calories in it. Same with protein. Every gram of fat, you can see how energy dense that is at 9 calories for every gram, and alcohol 7. But also remember that if you were to eat 1 gram of carbohydrate, that it actually takes a little bit of energy just to use that carbohydrate, to break it down, to digest it, and to store it. Same with protein and same with fat. The one that's the most calorically costly is protein out of those. So it actually costs quite a bit of energy to break down each gram of protein to use it. It takes a little bit less to do carbohydrates, and it takes even less still for fat. So it's unfortunately fat is very efficient, if you will, at being stored. Unfortunately, which means if you eat 9 calories worth a gram, you're basically storing almost all of that. Whereas with protein, you're probably only storing 3/4 of that ish. So let's go ahead and look at this in a little bit more detail, remembering the 4 macronutrients and the components that make up calories out, which is our basal metabolic rate, exercise, and daily activities. So there's our 3 main things there, and you see down the bottom, total daily energy expenditure equals BMR plus exercise plus general activities. Let's now measure them. So if you've got a pen and a calculator handy, as I said, you can scribble this down if you like. This is just one of the equations that you can use. There's actually plenty out there. None of them are dead accurate. They all use standardized data, but they do get pretty close. So for men, that top equation is what you'd use. All you need to do is to plug in your specific numbers. So the components that are in red, it's simply your weight in kilograms. So this equation takes into account your body weight, your height in centimeters, and your age in years. Now make sure it's kilograms, centimeters, and years, not pounds and meters, etc. Other equations use those. Some of the equations you'll find out there use, instead of weight, they use lean body weight, as in the body weight that you have excluding your fat makeup, what they call fat-free mass, so just your lean body mass, and that's actually slightly more accurate. That does presuppose, though, that you need to know your lean. So if you know your body fat percentage, then those equations are probably that little bit better. This is probably simpler just because you can plug the numbers in. So go ahead and do it. For the women, yours is 655. That's just general number plus. And for those that don't remember their maths, the old BIMDAS rule, do the brackets first. So literally plug your numbers in there. If you've got a calculator, rip it out. I'm actually going to go through 2 examples. Let's take the example of a 90-kilo male who's 30 years of age, and let's say a 60-kilo female who's also 30 years of age. Let's say the male's around the 6 foot mark. What's that? 181, 182 centimeters. And we'll say the female's around 165. So if you were to plug those in, what you can actually do is just do the brackets first. So the first bracket for the male is 13.7 times 90, which is 90 kilos, which comes to 1233. And just keep working like that. 5 times height, which is 181, 6.8 times 30, and you get a figure for those. Then you do outside the brackets, BIMDAS, if you remember. So 66 plus that, and you'll see that you come to an answer of 2,000, pretty much exactly 2,000 calories. That's for the male who's 90 kilos, 30 years of age, 6 foot. Now this is just their basal metabolic rate, remember. So this is their caloric needs if they were to lay down and do nothing all day. Let's take the female. If they were 60 kilos, 165 centimeters, and 30 years of age, you plug all that data in. If you can do that quickly, you'll get 1387. So 1,387. That's basal metabolic rate. So some people find these equations slightly higher than others. I find them, fairly accurate, maybe on a slightly higher end, but some people like to use really simple equations. In fact, if you're using kilograms and you use both of these equations, some people just say, look, just round it and use the figure 30. This is a very, very rough number, but if you just want a quick answer, use the number 30 and multiply it by your weight. Now that's rough because it doesn't take into account height, doesn't take into account age or sex or anything like that, but you'll actually get a number fairly similar. However, that is after taking into account that second general activities. Remember about your daily activities, which we're going to go into next. Some people use pounds. If you write the number down, 14, somewhere between 13 and 15 calories per pound of body weight, and that's for their basal metabolic rate plus their general activities throughout the day. So it's just everything not including exercise. So if you can quickly plug those numbers in or just write that equation down, you can get a general idea of what your BMR is, or what your needs are daily, and then look at this next screen. So this is the whole lifestyle factor. Whether someone's very highly active or someone's almost sedentary, their caloric needs are the difference is huge. So what we do is, if you were to look at one lifestyle factor, or what they call the activity factor one, and this is just a guide, it says take that BMR that we just worked out, let's say the male with 2,000 calories, and multiply that by the factor of 1.2. That would be for a sedentary person. The definition of that: little to no exercise or a desk job. If someone thought themselves, say, lightly active, which is like light exercise or light sport somewhere between 1 and 3 days a week, then they would multiply that BMR by 1.375. Obviously, moderately active, which is 3 to 5 days a week of moderate exercise, would multiply by 1.55. And you can even go to very active and extremely active. I almost never use those equations, because most of the people we deal with, although they think, yeah, I exercise a lot, I exercise hard and intense and hard levels of activity. Sometimes they over-exaggerate a bit, because you've got to keep in mind that this also accounts for people that are like, high levels of competition. Things like, marathoners, football players that train almost every day, morning and night. People that are running, 80, 90 Ks a week in a training, any given training week. So generally, I would work with 2 or 3 for most people we work with, meaning lightly active or moderately active. So let's go back to our example. If we look at the man who's 90 kilos, 181 and 30 years old, if we took their BMR, the basal metabolic rate, which is 2,000, and we took number 3, let's pretend that they're moderately active. Let's multiply that by 1.55, and we get 3,1, meaning 3,100. And that gives us an idea that if they were to consume 3,100 calories per day that comprise of all those 4 nutrients, hopefully our main 3 macronutrients, carbs, protein, and fat, we won't go into ratios just yet, but out of those, that they would pretty much maintain weight. If they maintain that moderately active lifestyle, meaning that exercise or play sport 3 to 5 days a week, moderate intensity, and for their size and weight, that's around about a pretty good, around the 3,000 calorie mark, just over. If we were to take the female, who's 60 kilos, 165 centimeters, 30 years of age, she had the basal metabolic rate of 1387. If you times that, let's say she's lightly active. So it's, okay, I exercise, somewhere between 1 and 3 days a week, light exercise or sport, and we multiply that by 1.375. It's around the 1900 cal mark. So if they were to consume 1900 calories, then they can maintain that weight and maintain their energy in and energy out balance pretty safely if they were to keep up that lifestyle. Again, some people see these BMR equation and the lifestyle factor or the activity factor as being on the slightly high end of equations, as there's many equations out there. And again, I use it as a rough guide. So, what we do is we sort of build into specificity later on. For now, just get a general guide of what you're kind of looking at. And then nothing beats a bit of tweaking. Meaning once you start, you get an idea, you play with it a little, and then you'll get to know you a little bit better. So once we've got our basal metabolic rate and our activity factor throughout the week, then we can move on. So once you've got a rough idea of your caloric intake, then we go to what are our goals. So when we talk about basic nutrition guidelines, I want to look at it from a couple of perspectives. The first being someone's goals. So they say, I want to gain weight, I want to gain muscle, or I want to lose weight, or I want to maintain weight, but I want to look at performance, getting the most out of my athletics performance. So the first thing we want to do is, let's assume that we want to change our composition, so either lose weight or gain weight. The next step 3, is to stipulate the desired surplus or deficit. So if someone wants to gain weight, they're going to go for a surplus. But let's assume that, for most people out there, they're looking to lose a bit of weight. We're talking about fat. So we're talking about stipulating a desired deficit. Now, low would be somewhere around the 200 to 300 calories per day below the figure that we just worked out. So let's say low is 250 calories a day. Let's take that female who was at around the 1900 cal mark, to drop it by about 250 calories a day. That's a deficit. So that person would slowly lose weight, and it's not a huge deficit, it's quite low, so the weight loss would be slow, but if they could do it consistently, it would be gradual. If they were to crank that up, let's say we went to around the 500 calories a day, and someone would class that as about average, that's a pretty good deficit as far as saying, you know, we're at, or the male at 3,000 calories, to drop by 500, you know, aim for around the 2.5, that person would start to lose weight quite gradually, but they'd lose weight over time if they kept up that exercise regime, as in their activity levels, and they stuck to that caloric intake. If we then went up to high, so that's somewhere around the 750 to 1,000 calories a day, keeping in mind that we're talking deficit, as in 750 to 1,000 calories below the figure that we stipulated, that number, then we're starting to really get up there. And when you see people like, you know, extreme, as in, you know, like the whole Biggest Loser thing, they can be up to like 2,000 calories a day or more, and that's very extreme, very extreme. Before we go into which one should you choose, let's have a quick look at this and why someone wouldn't want to go too low, as in if you stayed on maintenance level or very close to it, then you're not going to change your body composition, you're not going to lose weight. But if you're to say, hey, okay, great, I'm willing, I'm motivated, you know, I'm willing to do whatever it takes, I'll go right up to the high, well, there can be some pretty detrimental costs to that, as in you will lose weight and you will lose weight pretty quickly, but there's a downfall. If you have a look at this page, this says fat versus muscle. One of the topics we'll go into later, probably next webinar, is on the exercise side, some of the things that affects our basal metabolic rate, because we were talking about the basal metabolic rate being one of the main components of our TDEE, our total daily energy expenditure. But what are the factors that make that up? And one of them is lean body mass. There are many factors, age, sex, etc. But lean body mass being one of the more pertinent ones, and one of the ones that we can affect, as you know, you can't affect age and sex, etc. But if you were to look at, let's say, fat, if you were to take a pound of fat or a kilo of fat, depending on what you prefer to work with, they say there's around about 3,500 calories per pound of fat. If you're working in pounds, if you're working in kilos, somewhere around the 7,700 calories in every kilo of fat. Now look at muscle, right? Look down below where it says 600 calories per pound, or if you're working in kilos, about 1,320 calories. So you can see that every kilogram of muscle has much less calories in it. So now, what does that mean from a practical perspective? What does it mean from, let's say someone comes to you and says, you know, they've lost a certain amount of weight, but you don't know what that weight is. Well, let's come back to that. Look at the top example of the fat loss. Let's say someone lost 500 calories per day, 500 calories per day, and we said, look, we magically waved the wand and all of it came from fat, right? We know that all of it came from fat. 500 calories a day, can you see that that would work out to be a pound per week? Because if you say 500 times 7, 5 sevens are 35, so that's 3,500 calories, pretty much exactly a pound a week. If they lost 1,100 calories a day, remember we're talking around that extreme, or those very high deficits of calories beneath their maintenance level. 1,100 calories is pretty extreme. Per day, that'd be about a kilo a week, because if you times 1,100 by 7, that's 7,700. So that's a kilo of fat. And that's not easy to do. Some people say, I want to lose a kilo each week. Keep in mind what kind of deficit you need to do that. If anyone's seen one of those examples of a kilo of fat, it's really bulky, really, it's just like blubber. You get an idea of it. That's how much energy, that's almost pure energy. Now let's compare that to muscle. So let's say someone says, you know, I've lost this amount of weight. If we were to lose, look at that first example, if we lose 7,700 calories, like we did in the first example of 1,100 calories a day, would that be a kilo of muscle? As in, it was a kilo of fat. If we waved our wand and said we lose 1,100 calories a day, deficit from maintenance, every day for 7 days for a week, that's 7,700 calories for the week, deficit. We said, yeah, that's a kilo of fat if it came from. But what if it didn't come from fat? If that was from muscle, you have a look, that would be 5.8 kilograms of muscle, because you're simply dividing the 7,700 by 1320. So someone comes to you and they say, look, I lost 5.8 kilos this week. Fantastic. Now, if that all came from muscle, then, to them it's fantastic. They just see the scales look 5.8 kilos less, which is, exceptional for them. The person next to them says, geez, I only lost 1 kilo this week, but it all came from fat. That's a massive difference, especially when we talk about what that's going to do to the basal metabolic rate moving forward. Because losing your lean body mass, all that's doing is slowly lowering your basal metabolic rate, which is the major factor of your total daily energy expenditure. So now let's go back to that question, how much of a deficit would we want to do? Like when we talk about, we know our maintenance level, now what kind of deficit should we really aim for? And what I would generally urge someone to do is around the average mark, because low is, very safe. It's certainly not going to harm your metabolism at all. It's not going to harm that BMR, but it's also not going to get any radical results. To go around the average mark, around 500 calories a day, even up to about 700-ish, that's fairly safe. Fairly safe, as in, you can still maintain your metabolism, you can still maintain most of your lean body mass, but you're also getting enough deficit to create that caloric deficit for weight loss, so that the body is using or burning more calories than it's taking in, and obviously in the end that's a negative energy balance. That's weight loss. So I would urge around the 500 calories mark. So go ahead and do that. If you've got your figure, let's say our example male 3,000 calories, or our example female around the 1,900, take 500 from that as a rough goal, and that's what they're going to kind of shoot for. That's what they're going to shoot for their weight loss goals. Let me just forward past this. So now we've got our caloric figure. Where would that come from? Well, we spoke that there's only 4 nutrients it comes from: carbs, protein, fat, and alcohol. And for all intensive purposes for tonight, we're going to pretend that most of that isn't coming from alcohol. So let's just use carbohydrates, proteins, and fat, and say, great, how much of each should we use? And this is where you can get quite a bit of discrepancy. So we're going to go for kind of like a safe suggestion tonight. There's many ways you can tweak this, and we're going to do that later or in further webinars. So if some questions stem from this, fantastic, we want them. We probably won't cover it tonight because we just want to base it around the basic guidelines, but we will go into how to tweak this later. So this is some pretty safe guidelines. So let's go through each of the 3 macronutrients that make up this caloric goal that we're going to aim for, or roughly aim for, on a daily basis. So carbs first. You'll hear a lot of people say, it's the body's preferred source of energy, and it kind of depends on context, because if you're just sitting in a chair, then the preferred energy source is generally fat, at very, very low levels of intensity or low levels of activity. Fat is, but if you're doing anything, activity-based, the body prefers carbohydrates as its source. And one of the things to note is that the brain itself, pretty much your most important organ, must have glucose, in that it actually can't get fat across the blood-brain barrier. It's too big a molecule, unless it's broken down in a certain way that we kind of don't want, what they call incomplete breakdown, and it's got some byproducts to that. But just to simplify that, if we're talking about getting energy to the brain, it must have glucose. So when we talk about things like diabetes or hypoglycemia, that's low blood sugar levels, really we're talking about the brain, because like all other organs, can continue burning fat so long as you're not at massively high intensities of activity. Fat's fine, it can even break down protein or muscle tissue if it needs to, but the brain's got to have glucose. So that's why we need to have the blood sugar levels at least at a certain level. Low blood glucose is actually pretty good for burning fat, so keep that in mind for later. We do want, high blood sugar is not the mode for fat burning. It's not. It's the mode for fat storage. But so while we want it low, you can't go too low for long periods of time, just because the brain at some point is going to say, right, pick up the blood levels of glucose, or break down protein, muscle, and fats, in just a quick, incomplete way to give me some glucose. Carbohydrates are basically sugars or fibrous kind of starchy carbs, like things that come from veggies or your starchy kind of carbohydrates. Yeah, and we won't go into all of those details, but you can have a bit of a read. The next point is protein. So when you think about the body, most of it's water, but of all the dry mass, most of that's protein. It's like the stuff that makes up the structural components of cells, and all cells throughout your body. They say there's 22 amino acids, and they break them into essential and non-essential. Same sort of thing as fats. What they mean by essential isn't that you need it, because you need all of them, in which case they would all be called essential. It just means you can't make them. Your body can't make them. There are non-essential amino acids, which just means your body still needs them. They're essential from that perspective, but your body can make them. If you give the body, or you supply the body, the essential amino acids, it can actually make the rest. So there's only 8 or 10 that it says these are the ones we need to consume. The rest we can make. Ideally, we want to take them all in from a consumption perspective, but we definitely focus on the essentials. Same with fats. It says high TEF for protein, and I spoke about this before. Each nutrient has its own kind of caloric cost, meaning to consume it, digest it, break it down, assimilate it, and actually use it. It actually takes energy to do so. And we call that the thermic effect of food. Bit of a wanky term. It just means that thermic or thermogenesis just means it's burning calories, burning energy, and produces heat. So the thermic effect of food is the amount of calories used to break down and store or to use a nutrient. And protein is probably one of the highest. So if you were to take in, for instance, 200 calories worth of protein, and you were to take in 200 calories worth of fat, in the end, you'd end off with more calories from the fat because it didn't take as much calories to use it. Whereas it would burn, of those 200 calories of protein, a significant portion of that's actually being used to assimilate it or digest it. You look at that last point, protein can be used by the body to derive glucose when carbs are low. So when you hear some people say that they'll go ultra low carbohydrate diet, keeping in mind that carbohydrates being a pretty significant energy source, by dropping that out, it does put the body in a pretty good position for fat loss, for burning fat, or preferentially using fat as the substrate for energy. That's fantastic. Keep in mind though that there is this cost, because certain organs, particularly the brain, it absolutely needs glucose. So what the body will do is, through this process of gluconeogenesis, it'll actually take protein and break it down into a glucose just so it can use it. So when someone says, look, I don't eat any carbs, it's not totally true. If they consume huge amounts of protein, then your body's getting carbs. It's getting it. It's just getting it from the protein, that's all. It'll preferentiate its nutrient or its substrates to take what it wants. So finally, that brings us to fats. Different types of fats: saturated, mono, polyunsaturated, and trans. They're the crappy ones. And again, we've got essential and non-essential. Essential just meaning that we need to consume them. And you hear a lot about the whole omega-3s and omega-6s, and there's even omega-9s. You don't need them in the same ratios. In fact, the ones you want the most are the omega-3s, almost 2 to 1, they say, through omega-3 to omega-6. But either way, the fats that you do consume in your diet, you want them, most of them coming from your essential fats. So that ideally, we're going to drop down, cut down the trans fats, and even the saturated fats. You don't want to cut them out, because there are needs for them. There are good uses for saturated fats, but you do want to cut them down. You can see the related diseases, some of the weight loss effects of fat, or from dropping fat out. And down the bottom where it says there must be some good fats in the diet. So when someone says they want to cut fat out totally, that's certainly not the aim. We do want to cut it down, but not out. And keep it around the 15 to 20% of total calories. I know some diets that, like Atkins and stuff like that, would certainly pump that figure up right up around the 60 mark, 60% of total calories. And it's not to knock that. I don't think they're bad in any way. They work. but they do have they do have some side effects. So we usually try and aim for fairly low to moderate fats. Generally not much more than 25, quarter, as in 25% of total caloric intake. Sometimes up to 30, but usually we keep it down 15 to 20, and preferentiate the essential fats for most of them. Now, when we talk about those ratios, if we talk about certain diets, and remember, keep in mind we've got our caloric figure, our number that we said, all right, that's what we're going to aim for. That includes our activity level, it includes our basal metabolic rate, and it includes our caloric deficit that we're going to aim for to stimulate or produce some negative energy balance that that will bring about weight loss or burning fat. Let's look at carbs, proteins, and fats, and go through that. There's many different diets out there. Generally, if a diet has 55 to 60%, in that kind of vicinity, or anything above, percent of its calories coming from carbohydrates, we would generally consider that being high, as in high carb. So if they say, 70% of our caloric intake comes from carbohydrates, we'll call that a high carb diet. If they said somewhere between 40 to 50, we'll call it just a moderate carbohydrate diet. And anything around 25, 35% caloric intake coming from carbs, we'll call it low carbs. So if someone says zero, it's almost never the case. It's never no carbs. It's generally low. There certainly are some diets where they get lower than that, but that's very, very low. So there's high, moderate, and low for carbohydrates. Protein, generally in the 35 to 40% range, we would call high, and obviously above that. I certainly know people that go way above that. Generally not necessary, but that would be considered high. 25 to 30 is probably moderate, and around the 15 to 24 is probably low. And anything below that, of course. Some people get way below that. They don't focus on their protein needs. They're way below that. And fat, high would be considered around the 40 mark. As I mentioned before, there's certain diets that actually specify fat intake being high, more so because they're trying to cut carbs out. So if you look at a very low carbohydrate diet, you'll generally find fat being even higher than that, as in 50, 60% of caloric intake plus. Very high. Moderate would be 20 to 30-ish, and low would be 10 to 20. That's pretty low for fat. So if we look at all of those and say, great, so what would be kind of like a safe general figure that we use? Well, very simply, go for the moderates, right? So as a starting point, we would go for moderate. So moderate would be 40 to 50 for carbs, 25 to 30 for protein, 20 to 30 for fat. If you look at this slide, there, 50, 30, 20, that's a pretty safe kind of starting guide. And what we would do is, if you can take that figure that you've got, your caloric target for the day, and break it up here. So if we were say, great, there's, we want, let's say someone's aiming for, let's say 1,500 calories. I say, right, that's my target for the day. And they say, for a starting guide, I want 50% of it to come from carbohydrates. And remember, this very much comes down to a person's lifestyle, their activity levels, etc. If they're totally sedentary, then they're certainly not going to need that many carbohydrates. Likewise, if they're highly active, they're a triathlete, training every day, then they're probably going to need more than 50% of the caloric intake coming from carbohydrates. But that's why I say we want to get to that in future webinars. Let's go into more details in that later. For now, let's go into a general starting guideline that everyone can, be pretty safe from. So if we were to say 1,500 calories, 50% coming from carbs, that means 750 calories of our daily intake is purely from carbs. Now, how many grams is that? We remember we said there's 4 grams in every, there's 4 calories in every gram of carbs. So if you take your 750 and you divide it by 4, that says 187.5. So say 187 grams of carbs, and that would be that person's carbohydrate intake if they're aiming for this very general, like, safe kind of level to start from. And same with protein. If you were to take 30% of 1,500, very simple maths, whack it in, it's 450 calories coming from protein, and to get your grams, again, you divide it by 4 because there's 4 calories per gram of protein. That's 112 grams. And fat, remember, you're dividing by 9 because there's 9 calories per gram. So you can get an idea or rough idea of what you can make your nutrition of daily from those guidelines. And look down the bottom, it says this is a starting guide and will be slightly altered or adjusted for individual results and body types, lifestyles, etc. And they're the kind of questions that we want. Like, hey, I'm this, this, and this. I do this, this, and this. What would you suggest for? And then we can go into some really specific tweaks or alterations from that guideline. So what I want to do is put these kind of guidelines together into just something you can take away tonight, and then we'll open it up for questions from what we've covered so far, just to make sure everyone's got it. And if there are any questions, just post them in the bottom chat, like you did, Paul. I like the middle-aged bald guy. I'll get to that one soon, especially with the brown eyes. So let's look at tips for maximizing fat loss, covering what we've spoken about so far. The first thing we would talk about when we try and make up our target caloric goal is the quality of foods, which we haven't gone into yet. But by quality foods, we're talking about foods that are nutrient rich, that aren't too dense in calories, so what we call low caloric density for the majority of the time. Timing's really important. Just note that. We won't go into that tonight, but that's a very important topic. Glucagon dominance. Remember I spoke about blood sugar levels or controlling blood glucose, because when blood sugars are high, in that point, and there's times when you want glucose high, don't get me wrong, but during those times, your body's not really in a fat burning mode. So for fat burning mode, you want quite low blood glucose and therefore low insulin, and that means that glucagon, kind of like almost the opposite of insulin, that's dominant, that hormone, and we know that we're going to be preferentially using fat as a substrate for energy if the blood sugars are low. Post-training is an exception. We'll get to that another time. Separation of high GI response and fat intake. So when we talk about the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, a good little idea to keep in mind is that if you're going to go for something that it has a high GI response, remember glycemic index being anything kind of very high carby, especially sugary, that maybe separate that from when you get your fat intake. So instead of having fat and carbohydrates together, because then you've got this glucose response and you've got this insulin response, which is like a storing enzyme, at the same time as having high levels of fat in your blood, it's better to try and separate them. You can also use aids. You need people that are pretty serious, in their fat burning. They've got their training under order. They've got their diet in order. Just to add that little bit of a tweak, they can add some things like thermogenics, which just helps to boost their metabolism, speed up the whole BMR a little bit, or maybe it's an appetite suppressant, leptin sensitizers. We'll go into that another time, and just other aids that help burn fat. Lipolysis, as in burning lipids, burning fats. And one of the practical tips from ourselves is always preparation, meaning stack the odds in your favor. So whenever you're planning for a day's nutrition, the best thing you can do is plan ahead, because most of the excuses out there, sort of stem around, oh, I don't have time, or I can't eat that at that certain time because I'm working, or I'm on the run. Generally it's like a convenience thing. So if you plan ahead and you prepare, you got it in a container and it's labeled, and all you got to do is pull it out of the fridge and eat it, or whack it in the microwave, warm it up and eat it. Your odds are in your favor. You got much better chances of sticking with that diet. So there should be enough to work with. Let's open that up for questions, guys. If you do have a question, whack it in the chat box. I see some there now. If you've got microphone, I can actually give you voice, so you can have a bit of a chat. So let's see who's there. Does anyone have a question that's specific, Paul, specific? And yep, post it, and then I'll give you voice. And it also might take a bit of time for that to happen, guys, because it takes a while for that to happen. And by the way, if there are no questions now, what I can suggest is that you are more than welcome to post them later, because all of this will be recorded and you can download it at any time from our website. Just go onto our website, download it. It'll just be like a video, and then just email us. Email us at info@conanfitness.com. And we can either make that as part of future webinars or hopefully hit it during that topic. Bryony, do you have a microphone? Because if you do, in a few seconds that you should be able to talk. So let us know if that comes live. Bryony's question, by the way, guys, is how does it work if you spread your intake over the week? Some high days versus low days. Great question. I'd actually put that down to each macronutrient. So if you were to take something like protein, for instance, and some people, they've got like a protein quota for the day. Let's say, oh, my aim is I need 90 grams of protein for the day, or I want 150 grams of protein for the day. It's a good thing to do, good thing to know. Something like protein, you're pretty safe in thinking of it from a week's quota. So if you were to get X amount of grams of protein in a day, and the next day was to be much less, and the next day you got some, the next day much less, but over the week you hit your quota, so think of it over a week quota, that's actually pretty safe. I wouldn't technically, I wouldn't opt for having it all in 1 or 2 days and then having no protein, but you actually can. It doesn't have to be exact. So if you wanted, say, 100 grams a day of protein, that's 700 grams for the week. You don't have to have 100 grams each day. You could have, 150 and then 50 and then 150 and that's actually fine. That would work well because the body does. They say the body doesn't store protein, but protein does stay in the blood, and if you're not haven't been without it for ages, and it does store in muscles because muscle is a store of protein. So you're pretty safe. Something like carbohydrates, the answer is the same, but it really comes down to training because the demand of the body. So if there's a high demand of carbohydrates, demand being you use it, then the body stores it in several places. The first being the blood. There's a very small store of carbohydrates, your blood sugar's in the blood. The next place is the liver, and that's just like, think of that as a warehouse for energy storage, the liver, so that, when between meals, so when you're fasting between meals, your body's got this slow supply of energy release, which comes from the liver. But once that's depleted, your sole source of carbohydrates comes from your muscles, as in it's stored in your muscles as glycogen. You've heard of muscle glycogen. That's just stored carbs, stored in the muscles. So the same sort of thing, to answer Bryony's questions, you can do that over high days and low days, so days where you take in more calories worth of carbohydrates than others. I would just generally arrange that around training. So if you haven't got voice yet, Bryony, it's probably just taking too long because I clicked it ages ago. But if that hasn't asked you a question, go again. Fat, I would just try and keep pretty low most days, but same sort of thing. Think of it from a week's quota. Any other questions? And if there's not, guys, no worries. We'll close it up in about a minute. Like I said, it will be recorded, so just download it from the website. Email us at any time, any questions you have, or if you have any topics that you'd like to hear of, that might be training based or nutrition, whatever, just flick it through to info@Conan Fitness, and we'll collate them and put them into a future webinar. So thanks for tonight. If there's any questions, flick them through. If not, I hope you got something out of tonight, and I hope you got something to aim for tomorrow. Good night, and we'll speak to you soon.